In the gilded ecosystem of Manhattan's Upper East Side, some family names are a skeleton key, unlocking any door, silencing any objection. The name Sterling was not a key, it was a battering ram. Arthur Sterling had forged an empire from iron and steel, bending the very skyline to his will. His daughter Veronica, however, had inherited the empire but not the grit. She was a creature of the new aristocracy, a dynasty of digital piranhas, whose power was measured in followers and whose cruelty was a currency for clicks. At the Alabaster Room, the city's most coveted restaurant, a hushed temple of gastronomy, where a single tasting menu cost more than a month's rent in Queens, Veronica Sterling's name was a harbinger of chaos. She could dismantle a chef's reputation with a sneering Instagram story, end a sommelier's career with a TikTok livestream. For years, she had reigned as the undisputed princess of this porcelain and crystal kingdom, a flawless tyrant in tailored silk. But all tyrants, especially the insecure ones, build their castles on foundations of sand. And what happens when a new waitress, a quiet art history student with an uncanny eye for detail, and a life dedicated to caring for the one man who taught her the difference between what is valuable and what is merely expensive, begins to see the cracks not in the porcelain, but in the Sterling family's most prized possession? This isn't a story about a simple comeuppance. It's about the meticulous, deliberate deconstruction of a fraud, one carefully observed detail at a time. The very air inside the Alabaster Room seemed filtered through old money. It carried a scent of starched linen, beeswax from the polished mahogany walls, and the faintest, almost undetectable floral note from the single perfect orchid that graced each table. For Aara Vance, it smelled of opportunity and crushing anxiety. 3 months ago, she'd been a graduate student, spending her days in the hallowed, dust-mote-filled libraries of Columbia University, writing her thesis on 17th century Dutch portraiture. Her nights were spent at her grandfather's bedside, reading to him from art auction catalogs, his own once brilliant mind clouded by a creeping fog of illness. Her scholarship had been unexpectedly cut, and the mountain of her grandfather's medical bills had become an Everest of debt. Now she was mastering a new kind of art history, the intricate lineage of the restaurant's regular clientele. She was adjusting the suffocatingly tight knot of her server's tie, a uniform that felt more like a costume for a play she hadn't auditioned for. Her first few weeks were a frantic education in the unspoken laws of the 1%. Water glasses were to be filled only when the guest made eye contact with the pitcher. A conversational pause lasting longer than 4 seconds was a cue to approach the table. The most important rule, however, was not written in the leather-bound employee manual. It was delivered in a hushed whisper by Marco, the head sommelier, a man whose weary eyes had seen decades of fortunes rise and fall. "See that corner table?" he murmured, polishing a ridiculously delicate Zolto wine glass. "Table 1. That's not a table, it's a throne, and the princess holds court there every Thursday." Aara followed his gaze. Table 1 was set in a discreet alcove, framed by 2 towering marble columns, offering its occupants a panoramic view of the dining room while remaining insulated from it. "The princess is Veronica Sterling," Marco said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. He held the glass up to the light, inspecting it for a non-existent smudge. "Daughter of Arthur Sterling. You know Sterling Industries. The man practically owns the rebar holding this island together." Aara knew the name, of course. Arthur Sterling was a New York legend, a self-made titan who was as respected for his business acumen as he was for his world-class art collection. His daughter, however, was famous in a more modern, more toxic way. Veronica, known to her 50 million followers as Vero-style, was a social media influencer whose brand was a volatile cocktail of unattainable luxury and public displays of contempt. "She's our most high-profile guest," Marco continued, his face grim, "and our most dangerous. Don't offer an opinion unless asked. Don't smile unless she smiles first. If she's filming one of her little videos for her phone, you become invisible. You do not exist. You are a ghost who refills water glasses." He paused, setting the glass down with finality. "One mistake, one word she deems cringe, and she won't just get you fired. She'll post your face to her 50 million followers and turn you into a meme. She'll make you unemployable and unhireable. She enjoys it. It's her sport. A cold knot formed in Aara's stomach. She had dealt with demanding professors and condescending academics, but this was a different beast entirely. This was cruelty as performance art. Is she really that bad? Aara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marco gave a short, bitter laugh. Last month, a new busboy, a kid named Leo, was clearing the table next to hers. He was so nervous his hands were shaking, and he accidentally rattled a stack of plates. It was barely a sound. She stopped her live stream, zoomed in on his terrified face, and said, "Ugh, the help here is so clumsy. Can you believe the noise pollution I have to endure?" She tagged the restaurant. The post got 3 million likes. Mr. Dubois, the manager, had to let him go the next day to appease her. She never even looked at the kid. He was just content. The story chilled Aara to the bone. It was a casual, thoughtless destruction of a life for the sake of engagement. In her studies, she'd learned about the casual cruelty of kings and queens. It seemed the modern world had simply given them better tools for it. At precisely 8 o'clock, a subtle shift occurred in the restaurant's atmosphere. The hostess's smile became a little more rigid, the waiter's postures a little more erect. Veronica Sterling had arrived. She wasn't with her father tonight. She was flanked by 2 other young women who looked like identical, slightly less expensive copies of herself. Veronica was a vision of calculated perfection. She wore a white silk dress that seemed to have been spun directly onto her body, and her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe glossy ponytail. But it was her face that was most unsettling. It was flawlessly beautiful, but utterly lifeless. Her expression a bored, contemptuous mask that only broke when she aimed it at the small, jewel-encrusted phone in her hand. She didn't walk through the dining room. She processed, her friends trailing like ladies in waiting. Aara was assigned to the station directly adjacent to table 1. For the first hour, she moved like a phantom, her focus absolute. She could hear Veronica's voice, a high, sharp sound that sliced through the ambient murmur of the room. She complained that the lighting wasn't optimized for selfies. She sent back a bottle of champagne because the bubbles were, she claimed, aggressively large. Each complaint was a small power play, a public reaffirmation of her status. The main event, the true performance, began with dessert. Aara's assigned table, a quiet elderly couple celebrating their anniversary, had ordered the restaurant's signature dessert, the Midnight Chocolate Sphere. It was an exquisite creation, a hollow globe of dark chocolate filled with raspberry mousse and gold leaf, which was then melted at the table by a stream of hot caramel sauce poured from a silver pitcher. It was a piece of culinary theater. As Aara approached her table with the dessert, she was acutely aware of Veronica's phone turning in her direction. She began her presentation, her hands steady as she explained the dessert to the delighted couple. "And now," she said softly, lifting the pitcher of caramel. "Oh my God, are you serious?" Veronica's voice cut across the room. "They're still doing that tacky melting chocolate thing? It's so 2018. Aara froze for a fraction of a second, the hot pitcher in her hand. The couple at her table looked mortified. She tried to ignore the comment, to focus on her guess. She began to pour the caramel. The chocolate sphere began to melt, revealing the glittering contents within. "This is just tragic," Veronica narrated to her phone, her voice dripping with scorn. "I'm here at the Alabaster Room, and they're serving desserts that belong in a suburban mall. And look at this waitress. That uniform is just sad." Aara's face burned with humiliation, but she kept her composure, forcing a smile for the couple she was serving. She placed the dessert on the table and turned to leave. As she passed table 1, Veronica stuck out a perfectly pedicured foot, shod in a stiletto that cost more than Aara's entire education. Aara stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the table before she could fall. The now empty silver pitcher clattered to the floor. "Wow, clumsy and tacky," Veronica said with a laugh, looking directly at her friends for affirmation. "Maybe you should watch where you're going." "My apologies, Mrs. Sterling," Aara said, her voice tight but even. She bent down to retrieve the pitcher. "You know what?" Veronica said, a sudden, cruel gleam in her eye. "My dessert is all wrong." Before Alara could react, Veronica picked up her own untouched slice of decadent, multi-layered chocolate fudge cake. It's just so boring. It needs a little something extra. With a swift, vicious movement, she stood up and smeared the entire slice of cake down the front of Alara's clean white uniform, then ground the rest of it into her cheek. The room fell into a shocked, profound silence. The rich, dark chocolate was a disgusting, sticky smear against her skin and the crisp linen. Lumps of fudge and frosting clung to her hair. Veronica's friends gasped, then burst into sycophantic laughter. Veronica held up her phone, capturing Alara's stunned, chocolate-covered face. "Now that's content," Veronica said with a triumphant smirk. Hashtag catastrophe. Alara stood, frozen, the smell of chocolate and sugar sickeningly sweet in her nostrils. She felt 1,000 eyes on her, a wave of pity, disgust, and morbid curiosity. But beneath the shock and the all-consuming humiliation, a different feeling began to smolder. It was a cold, quiet rage. In that moment, Veronica Sterling stopped being a person and became a problem to be solved. And Alara Vance, the quiet art history student, had just been given all the motivation she needed to solve it. Mr. Dubois, the manager, was at her side instantly, his face a mask of horrified apology, not for her, but for the scene. He shoved a napkin into her hand and began stammering apologies to Veronica, who waved him off with a flick of her wrist, already editing the video on her phone. "Just get her out of my sight," Veronica commanded, not even looking up. "She's ruining the aesthetic." And just like that, in front of a room full of the city's most powerful people, Alara was fired, escorted through the kitchen with her face still covered in chocolate, the laughter from table one echoing behind her. As she walked out into the cool night air, the sticky mess on her cheek began to feel less like a humiliation and more like war paint. The princess had drawn first blood. She had no idea who she had just declared war on. The walk home was a blur of shame and fury. Alara scrubbed the caked-on frosting from her face in the cramped bathroom of her small apartment, the sweet smell of chocolate now seeming like the stench of her own failure. The video, she knew, would be online by now, her face a viral spectacle for Veronica's followers. The thought of it, of millions of strangers laughing at her lowest moment, was a fresh wave of sickness. She was jobless. The rent was due. Her grandfather's pharmacy bill was sitting on the kitchen counter, a stark white reminder of her responsibilities. For a moment, she allowed herself to crumble, slumping against the cold tile, the weight of it all pressing down on her. Revenge was a luxury she couldn't afford. What she needed was a job, any job and fast. But as she stared at her reflection in the mirror, the raw, scrubbed skin, the defiant spark in her tired eyes, the academic, analytical part of her brain, the part she had honed for years, began to take over. Anger was an emotion. Humiliation was a feeling. A problem, however, was something that could be systematically dismantled. Veronica Sterling and the power she wielded were the problem. Her grandfather had taught her that to truly understand a piece of art, you couldn't just look at the painting. You had to understand the artist, their patrons, their history, their secrets. "Everything has a provenance, Ellie," he used to say, his voice thick with the accent of his native Germany. "A history of ownership. Find the provenance, and you find the truth." Alara decided to apply that lesson to the House of Sterling. Her investigation didn't begin with a Google search. It began with memory. She closed her eyes and went back to the alabaster room. For weeks, she had served the Sterlings. Arthur, when he dined, often did so in the restaurant's private study, a small wood-paneled room reserved for its most important patrons. While clearing his table one evening, she had noticed the art on the walls. It was a curated collection of smaller, more intimate pieces from his vast portfolio. Her gaze had been drawn to one in particular. It was a small, unassuming seascape by a lesser-known Dutch Golden Age painter, Jan Porcellus. It was beautiful, but what had struck her was Arthur Sterling's reverence for it. He'd been on the phone speaking in a low voice. "No, not for any price," he'd said. That one was the first. It's the cornerstone. The cornerstone, the foundation of a legendary collection." Alara sat down at her laptop, the keys clicking softly in the quiet apartment. She pushed aside thoughts of job applications and focused. She began to research the painting, Storm at Sea with Shipwreck by John Porcellus, specifically the one listed in the Sterling Collection's official online catalog. The provenance was impeccable, or so it seemed. It traced the painting's history from the artist's studio in the 1630s through a series of noble European families, its sale at a minor auction in the 1950s, and finally its acquisition by a young, ambitious Arthur Sterling in the late 1970s. It was the purchase that had launched his career as a serious collector, earning him the respect of the art world. But something nagged at Aara. Her grandfather, a world-renowned appraiser before his illness, had specialized in authenticating works from that exact period. He had trained her eye, teaching her to see not just the image, but the object itself. He'd show her high-resolution photographs, pointing out the subtle cricolure, patterns unique to different canvases, the way certain pigments faded over centuries, the almost imperceptible tremor in a forger's brushstroke as they tried to replicate a master's confidence. She accessed her university's deep digital archives, pulling up every known work by John Porcellus. She found high-resolution images of his other seascapes, his authenticated signatures, close-ups of his brushwork. She spent hours, her eyes burning from the screen's glare, comparing, cross-referencing, zooming in on the Sterling painting until the image dissolved into a matrix of pixels. Then she saw it. It was a tiny detail, something that 999 out of 1,000 experts might miss. In the dark, churning waves on the bottom right corner of the Sterling painting, there was a particular shade of blue, a deep, vibrant, almost electric blue used to highlight the froth of a breaking wave. The official catalog entry listed the medium as oil on oak panel. The blue, according to her spectroscopic analysis training, looked suspiciously like Prussian blue. The problem? Prussian blue wasn't invented until 1706. It was an anachronism, a single, tiny, impossible speck of color that had no business being on a painting from the 1630s. Aara's breath caught in her throat. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, exhilarating rhythm. It wasn't just a mistake in the catalog. It was proof, a single, unassailable fact. She ran the analysis again, cross-referencing pigment databases. There was no doubt. Arthur Sterling's cornerstone, the very foundation of his reputation as a collector with an infallible eye, was a fake. A brilliant, masterfully executed, but undeniable forgery. She leaned back, the enormity of her discovery washing over her. This was not a small piece of gossip. This was a secret that could shatter a dynasty. The financial fallout would be immense, but the damage to Arthur Sterling's legacy, to his carefully constructed identity, would be incalculable. It was the kind of secret that could level a castle. The question was, what was she going to do with it? This knowledge was a weapon of immense power. She could leak it to the press, destroying the Sterling name in a firestorm of scandal that would make a smeared cake seem like a forgotten footnote. She could humiliate Arthur Sterling, just as his daughter had humiliated her. But as she looked over at the pharmacy bill on her counter, at the worn copy of her grandfather's favorite art book on the shelf, she knew it wasn't that simple. Her grandfather had revered Arthur Sterling, not for his money, but for his supposed love of art. "He sees the soul of the work, Ellie," he had once said. Destroying the man's legacy felt like a betrayal of her grandfather's own values. No, a public explosion was Veronica's style. It was loud, messy, and ultimately unsatisfying. Aara's approach would have to be different. It would be quiet, precise, and surgical. She wouldn't just expose a fraud. She would use the truth to rebalance the scales, to seek not revenge, but a very specific and much more meaningful form of justice. The girl with the photographic memory and the eye for detail had found the family's foundational lie. Now she just had to figure out how to present it to the king himself. Possessing a secret of this magnitude was one thing. Deploying it was another. Aara couldn't just call Sterling Industries and ask to speak to the CEO. She couldn't send an anonymous email that would be instantly dismissed as the ravings of a lunatic or a disgruntled employee. She needed a stage. She needed to confront Arthur Sterling directly, in a setting where he couldn't simply have her removed by security. For 2 days, Alara worked methodically, using her research skills to track Arthur Sterling's upcoming public appearances. She found her opening in a press release from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In 1 week, Sterling Industries was sponsoring a high-profile gala, A Night with the Masters, to unveil a new wing dedicated to Dutch art. Arthur Sterling was the guest of honor and was slated to give the keynote address. Tickets were a staggering $5,000 a plate, an impossible sum. But the press release mentioned that a limited number of standing room-only tickets for the speech and reception would be made available to university students in relevant fields of study. Her Columbia ID was still valid. She spent the next week preparing, not for a confrontation, but for a presentation. She compiled her evidence into a slim, professional-looking portfolio. High-resolution, magnified images of the painting, side-by-side comparisons of the brushwork with authenticated porcelain works, the spectroscopic data on the Prussian blue pigment, and a meticulously researched paper on the forged provenance, tracing how a known forger active in the 1960s had specialized in creating lost works by Dutch masters. She was not an angry ex-waitress. She was a scholar presenting her findings. The night of the gala, Aara dressed in the only formal outfit she owned, a simple, elegant black dress she'd bought for a scholarship dinner years ago. She wore her hair pulled back and her only piece of jewelry, a small silver locket her grandfather had given her. She looked not like a waitress, but like a serious young academic. Inside the museum, the atmosphere was dizzying. The air hummed with power and privilege. Aara clutched her portfolio, her palms sweating, and found a discreet position near the back of the grand hall where the speech was to be held. She saw Veronica holding court near the front, resplendent in a glittering couture gown, her phone, as always, in her hand, documenting every moment. Arthur Sterling took the stage to thunderous applause. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and the confident bearing of someone who had never had a door closed in his face. He spoke eloquently about his passion for art, about the responsibility of collectors to preserve history. He spoke of his own journey, starting with one small, powerful painting. "It was a seascape by Jan Porcellus," he said, his voice filled with genuine emotion. "It taught me that art isn't an investment. It's a conversation with the past. That painting became the cornerstone of everything I believe in: authenticity, integrity, and the enduring power of truth." Aara felt a pang of something close to pity. He believed it. He had built his life on a lie, but he didn't know it. After the speech, as the crowd began to move towards the reception in the new wing, Aara knew it was her moment. She navigated the throng of tuxedos and gowns, her heart pounding against her ribs. She saw Arthur Sterling standing with the museum's director, accepting congratulations. Veronica was at his side, looking bored. Aara took a deep breath and approached them. "Mr. Sterling?" He turned, his eyes initially dismissive, sweeping over her as if she were part of the catering staff. But then a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He remembered her. Before he could speak, Veronica stepped forward, a look of utter disbelief and contempt on her face. "You have got to be kidding me," she sneered, her voice low but venomous. "Security? How did she get in here?" She looked Aara up and down. "Still chasing after the rich and powerful, I see. Did you come to throw a bread roll at me? What are you going to do? Stain my dress with hors d'oeuvres this time?" "Veronica, that's a no." The silence that fell around them was not empty. It was a vacuum, pulling in the ambient chatter of the gala, the distant clinking of glasses, the very air of the grand hall, and compressing it into a point of unbearable density. Arthur Sterling's face, a moment ago the benevolent mask of a public philanthropist, had collapsed into its true form, a landscape of sharp angles and cold, calculating shadows. The name Jan Porcellus had been the key. The word provenance was the turning of the lock. Veronica, however, existed only on the surface of things. She saw not the strategic shift in her father's posture, but a personal affront. "A researcher," she spat, the words dripping with a theatrical disdain she had perfected for her online audience. "You were clearing crumbs 5 minutes ago." "Dad, she's a deranged stalker. This is what happens when you're kind to the staff. They get obsessed." "Security," she called, her voice rising in pitch, turning heads. "Get this unhinged nobody out of here before she makes a scene." "I believe, Mr. Sterling," Aara said, her voice a low, steady counterpoint to Veronica's shrillness, her gaze never leaving the older man's face, "that the scene has already been made. My presence here is merely the denouement." She held out the slim black portfolio. It felt impossibly heavy in her hands, a vessel containing the atomic weight of a lifetime's lie. "It's regarding the chemical composition and documented history of your porcelain, storm at sea with shipwreck. It will only take 5 minutes of your time." Arthur Sterling's affable persona had not just vanished, it had been surgically excised. The man who looked at her now was the one who broke unions, who devoured competitors, who had bent the city's skyline to his will. He knew the scent of a threat, whether it came from a boardroom or a young woman in a borrowed dress. There was a dangerous stillness in Aara's eyes, a terrifying lack of fear that told him this was no mere shakedown. This was an execution. A forgery? Veronica's laugh was a brittle, ugly thing. "Oh, that's precious. My father's cornerstone piece? He is the world's most respected collector of the Dutch masters. You are a clumsy waitress who smells faintly of floor polish, and you think you can lecture him on art. This is the most pathetic, desperate, and frankly embarrassing revenge fantasy I have ever witnessed." She lunged for the portfolio, her manicured fingers like claws. "Let me see this pathetic little dossier of yours." "Veronica?" Arthur's voice was soft, but it cut through the air like a shard of ice. He did not raise his voice. He lowered it, a far more terrifying signal. He placed a heavy, restraining hand on his daughter's arm. Her momentum ceased instantly. His eyes, the color of wet slate, were fixed on Aara. He saw no hysteria, no pleading. He saw only the calm, unassailable certainty of a mathematician who had solved an impossible equation. "Let me see." The words were not a request. They were a command. Aara opened the portfolio on a nearby marble pedestal, creating a small, sterile stage under the museum's track lighting. The world around them seemed to recede, the gala's hum fading into a distant roar. There was only the three of them, and the truth laid bare on archival paper. She did not speak of the restaurant, of the smeared cake, of the public stripping of her dignity. She spoke only of facts, her voice the cool, detached tone of a scholar defending a thesis. "The pigment used for the sea foam on the lower right quadrant, sir," she began, pointing to a magnified, spectrographic image. "It has the chemical signature and refractory index of Prussian blue. It fluoresces in a manner wholly inconsistent with azurite or cobalt, pigments available to Porcellus and his contemporaries. Prussian blue was not synthesized until 1706. This painting is dated 1632. She turned a page with a quiet rustle that sounded like a thunderclap in the charged silence. "This is a copy of the listed provenance, a sales record from the von Schreiber family auction, dated 1952. My research into paper archives, however, confirms the watermark in the document's letterhead. It belongs to a paper mill founded in Munich in 1961. She tapped the faint, almost invisible insignia. "The document that proves the painting's history was created almost a decade after it was supposedly printed." One by one, she dismantled the illusion. The anachronistic tightness of the canvas weave, common in mid-20th century reproductions. The chemically induced craquelure, which under 50x magnification showed a telltale uniformity, unlike the organic, spiderweb cracking of centuries-old oil paint. The signature, a perfect textbook rendering, lacking the fluid, almost careless confidence of the artist's hand in his authenticated letters and sketches. Her presentation was a masterpiece of forensic aesthetics, calm, professional, and utterly, irrevocably devastating. Veronica stood frozen, her mouth slightly agape. The weapons in her arsenal, scorn, mockery, social currency, were useless here. This was a language she did not speak, a battlefield she could not comprehend. Her world was built on fleeting perceptions and viral moments. Aara had come armed with immutable fact. Arthur Sterling said nothing. He stared at the portfolio, his face graying under the warm museum lights. He was not looking at evidence anymore. He was watching the demolition of his own personal mythology. The story he had told himself, the story he had told the world, that of the rough kid from Queens with the golden gut and the infallible eye, was a fiction. The cornerstone of his identity, the very first beautiful thing he had ever owned, was a cheap lie he had bought and sold to himself for 40 years. The silence stretched, thick with the ghosts of faked histories and buried truths. He slowly raised his head, his gaze moving from the damning pages to Aara, and then finally to his daughter. For the first time, he seemed to see them both with a horrifying clarity. He saw Veronica, vibrating with a useless, impotent rage, her face twisted into the familiar sneer she reserved for the help. Her only instinct was to attack, to humiliate, to destroy. And he saw Aara, the target of that casual cruelty, who had not responded with a scream, but with a scalpel. She had absorbed the humiliation and transmuted it, through intelligence and sheer force of will, into this moment of absolute, undeniable truth. The connection between the chocolate-smeared uniform and the fake provenance snapped into place in his mind with the force of a physical blow. One was a symptom, the other the disease. The disease was fraudulence, the empty, vapid performance of power without substance. He had spent a lifetime building an empire on the bedrock of authenticity, all while the most cherished object in his home, and he now realized the most cherished person, was a glittering, hollow fake. The king, standing in a temple built to honor his name, finally understood that the greatest forgery in his collection wasn't the painting. The shift was almost imperceptible, but total. The titan of industry receded, and the father, faced with a catastrophic failure, emerged. "Veronica," he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing, utterly devoid of warmth or affection. "Go to the car. Wait for me there." "But Dad, she's a liar. It's a trick. We can counter-sue. We can ruin her for—" "Go, to, the car." He did not look at her. He spoke the words like he was passing a sentence, each one a stone dropping into a deep well. The cold, final authority in his tone was something she had never, in her entire pampered life, had directed at her. She physically recoiled, her mouth snapping shut. Her face cycled through a storm of disbelief, fury, and a flicker of something new. Fear. With a final, venomous glare at Aara that promised a retribution she was no longer capable of delivering, she turned and fled, her couture gown trailing behind her like a shroud. Arthur did not watch her leave. He gently closed the portfolio, his movements slow and deliberate, as if his hands belonged to a much older man. "There is a small office behind the Vermeer exhibit," he said to Aara, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Please, walk with me." The office was a quiet, anonymous space, insulated from the distant celebration. It smelled of leather and lemon polish. Arthur Sterling did not sit behind the large mahogany desk. He slumped into one of the visitors' chairs, the portfolio resting on his lap like a tombstone. For several long minutes he said nothing, just turned the pages again and again, as if hoping the images might change. The facts might rearrange themselves into a less damning configuration. They did not. The Titan looked broken. 42 years, he finally murmured, speaking to the room, to the past. It hung over the fireplace in my study. The first thing I saw in the morning, the last thing I saw at night. I bought it when I had just made my first million. Everyone told me I was a brute, a scrapyard dog with money. But I saw this painting at a small gallery, and I knew, I felt it. Its power, its history, it was my proof. He finally looked at Aara, his eyes hollowed out, filled with a terrible brew of shame, rage, and a nascent, agonizing respect. Proof that a boy like me could understand beauty, that I belonged. And you, a girl my daughter tried to break for sport, you saw through it all in 3 months with a library card. He leaned forward, the predator re-emerging from the wreckage, his voice regaining its sharp edge. "So this is the part where you tell me what you want, Ms. Vance. It's a simple transaction. I have a problem, and you are the solution. Do you want money? A check with enough zeros to make you forget this ever happened? Do you want a career? A recommendation to any museum or auction house on the planet? Name it. Let's finish this." This was the moment, the final test. Aara felt the pull of it, the seductive simplicity of the offer. A single word and all her problems, the rent, the debt, her grandfather's crushing medical bills would vanish. But she thought of the searing humiliation of that night, the feeling of being less than human, a prop in someone else's cruel theater. A check could not erase that. A check was what Arthur Sterling gave. It wasn't what he paid. "I am not a problem for you to solve, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "I am the consequence. What your daughter did to me wasn't a prank. It was an exercise in dehumanization. She wanted to show her 50 million followers that people like me are disposable, that our dignity is a toy for her to break. That is a debt, and its currency isn't money." She leaned forward slightly, mirroring his posture, meeting his gaze as an equal. "My grandfather was an art appraiser in Germany before the war. He lost everything: his family, his business, his collection. When he came to this country, he had nothing but his eye for the truth. He taught me that the difference between something valuable and something expensive is authenticity. He revered you, Mr. Sterling. He thought you were one of the few who understood that. What I want," she took a deep breath, the words landing with surgical precision, "is for you to become the man my grandfather thought you were. I want you to pay the debt by acknowledging the fraudulence in your own house. Not on the wall, in the mirror." His eyes widened. He had expected a number. He had received a sermon. He had expected a negotiation. He had been handed a moral reckoning. For the second time that night, he was rendered utterly speechless. The days that followed were a unique form of torment for Aara. She had fired a cannonball at the heart of an empire, and then walked away, and now the silence was deafening. Nothing happened. The rent was still due. She scoured job listings, the irony a bitter taste in her mouth. She held a secret that could detonate the New York art world, yet she couldn't afford her electricity bill. She sat by her grandfather's bedside, reading to him from a book on Rembrandt, the quiet beeping of the machines a steady rhythm beneath her own frantic heartbeat. Had she miscalculated? Was Sterling simply going to bury it? Bury her, pretending the conversation never happened? The thought was a cold knot of dread in her stomach. The doubt began to fester. She had refused the money, standing on a principle that felt more and more like a luxury she could not afford. Then on the 10th day, a sleek black car, the kind that moved silently through the city like a shark, pulled up outside her modest Queens apartment building. A man in a tailored suit hand-delivered a thick cream-colored envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were two things. The first was a cashier's check. The number written on it was obscene, a figure that didn't seem real, more than enough to secure her grandfather's care in the finest facility for the rest of his days, to erase her student debt, to change the entire trajectory of her life. It was so much money it felt like a gag, a final assertion of his power. But it was the letter, written on heavy personal stationery in a thick, decisive black ink, that held the true payment. "Ms. Vance," it began, "I have had the porcelain authenticated by 2 independent experts. You were, of course, correct on every count. It has been removed from my home. The empty space on the wall is a potent and necessary reminder. There is no adequate apology for my daughter's behavior, nor for my failure to recognize the person she had become. The world she inhabits is a hall of mirrors, and I have come to realize I was one of the people holding them up for her. That has now ended. Her public platform has been permanently dismantled. She is, for the first time, contending with an uncurated reality. Whether this leads to any meaningful change in her character is yet to be seen, but the performance is over. The enclosed check is not a settlement, it is restitution. It is a partial payment on the debt you described. The rest cannot be paid in cash. Your grandfather was right about authenticity. It is the only currency with enduring value. It seems I have been trading in counterfeit for some time. Your talent, Ms. Vance, is the ability to spot the difference. Such a talent is wasted on uncovering the mistakes of old men. I am restructuring a significant portion of my philanthropic foundation. I am endowing a new independent initiative, the Cornerstone Project. Its sole mission will be to provide pro bono authentication, conservation, and provenance research for smaller public museums and collections, the ones that are most vulnerable to the very fraud that I fell for. It requires a director with an unimpeachable eye, uncompromising integrity, and the courage to speak truth to power. This is not a gift, it is a job offer. Your first assignment, should you accept, will be to advise me on what to hang in that empty space on my wall. Sincerely, Arthur Sterling. Aara sat with the letter for a long time, the check lying forgotten on her small kitchen table. This was more than a job. It was a move on a chessboard she hadn't even known they were playing on. He wasn't just paying her off. He was binding her to him, transforming her from an adversary into an asset. To accept was to tie her future to the Sterling name, to work for the very system that had produced Veronica. To refuse was to walk away, to remain pure but powerless. She looked around her small apartment, at the stack of bills, at the worn armchair where her grandfather used to sit. He had taught her to see the truth in a painting. Arthur Sterling was offering her the chance to defend that truth for the world. It was not revenge. It was not even justice. It was something far more complex and interesting. It was restoration. 1 year later, Aara Vance stood in the cool, quiet basement archive of a small historical society in upstate New York. She wore a lab coat over a simple dress, and the air smelled of old paper and linseed oil. On a padded easel in front of her sat a dusty, forgotten portrait of a 19th century town founder. The museum's nervous director hovered behind her. "We always thought it was by a student of Thomas Sully," the director whispered, "but we never had the budget to have it properly looked at." Aara shone a handheld UV lamp over the canvas. She leaned in close, her eyes scanning the dark, cracked varnish. She saw it almost immediately. A faint, ghostly trace of an underdrawing, a cross-hatching technique in the shadows of the subject's coat that was the artist's unique, unmistakable signature. She smiled. "I don't think this is by a student," she said softly. "I think you have a lost Sully." The director's gasp of joy echoed in the quiet room. This was her work now. She didn't uncover fakes to destroy legacies. She uncovered truths to restore them. She led a small, dedicated team, funded by a seemingly infinite Sterling endowment, and they were becoming the art world's quiet protectors. Back in her office in Manhattan, a package was waiting for her. There was no card. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was a small, unassuming seascape. It was a work by John Porcellus, a real one. Small, powerful, authentic. She knew without asking that it had cost a fortune and had taken months of searching to acquire. It was not a gift. It was a piece of a conversation. She hung it on the wall opposite her desk. It was not a trophy. It was a reminder that empires are built on stories, and that the most powerful person is not the one with the loudest voice, but the one who knows which stories are true. She had not set out to topple a king or punish a princess. She had simply demanded that things be called by their proper names. And in doing so, she had discovered that the most profound act of rebellion isn't to tear down a fraudulent castle, but to build something true and lasting in its place.